Caleb Brennan hadn't planned on making enemies when he moved out of the city. After 30 years of working inside government buildings and navigating bureaucratic puzzles for a living, all he wanted was silence, order, and the freedom to maintain his property the way he saw fit. He had spent most of his life advising people on infrastructure policy, drainage management, zoning codes, municipal easements, the kinds of topics that made most people's eyes glaze over. But for Caleb, systems meant stability, and when he finally retired from his role as an advisor in the Department of Urban Engineering, he used every ounce of that knowledge to build something for himself. Not something flashy or grand, just correct. He purchased a modest piece of land on the outer ring of a semi-rural county, not entirely off-grid, but far enough that traffic, noise, and people's unsolicited opinions didn't regularly intrude. The property had once belonged to a reclusive woodworker and was mostly overgrown, with a rutted dirt path that had eroded from years of neglect and seasonal flooding. Caleb spent the first 6 months restoring it. He cleared brush, repaired the septic lines, and designed a private gravel driveway using an aggregate formula he'd picked up from a stormwater mitigation pilot project years ago. He didn't just dump rocks in a line, he installed side slopes, compacted the base with calculated moisture levels, and layered the top with a gravel mix that could support runoff, avoid washouts, and withstand freeze-thaw cycles. It wasn't pretty in the decorative sense, but it was resilient and intentional, the kind of road you could trust under pressure, the kind you respected because it was honest. His house wasn't much from the outside, a single-level ranch-style design with a steel roof and reinforced gutters, but inside, everything was exactly where it needed to be. His tools had their place. His systems ran efficiently. His evenings were quiet. He had no interest in socializing, organizing barbecues, or pretending to care about lawn competitions. His land was just outside the jurisdiction of the local neighborhood committee, a self-managed cluster of residents who styled themselves as a civic association, but operated more like a suburban club with power complexes. Caleb had checked the land records meticulously before buying. His parcel was not listed within the association's boundaries. He paid no dues. He received no newsletters. And, most importantly, he owed them nothing. For over a year, life remained steady. Caleb repaired what needed repair, observed weather patterns like a scientist, made small improvements when the budget allowed, and maintained his gravel drive with precision. Each spring, he checked for edge creep. After every storm, he walked the slope with a surveyor's eye. He wasn't obsessive, just thorough. The road wasn't just a path to his house. It was part of the house, an extension of the philosophy that if something is designed right, it shouldn't need to be corrected by someone else's idea of standard. Caleb believed in logic over appearance. And logic told him that what he built worked. That piece was disrupted in the most quietly absurd way imaginable, with a laminated sign, zip-tied to his mailbox post. It wasn't from the city or the county. It had no seal, no official contact, no letterhead, just bold red text over a yellow background. Unsafe surface. Driveway may pose risk to vehicle stability. Neighborhood Committee review initiated. At first, Caleb thought it was a prank. The language was amateurish, the sign was crooked, and there was no signature. But the implication rattled him. Someone had not only assessed his driveway without notice, they had done so without jurisdiction. And they had felt confident enough to warn others. He removed the sign immediately, took a photo for record-keeping, and assumed it was a one-off annoyance. Maybe one of the nearby residents was upset that his driveway didn't match theirs. No polished concrete, no stamped pattern, just gravel with purpose. But within days, another marker appeared. A small plastic stake with reflective tape, planted just off the edge of his drive, this time labeled Phase 1 Survey. That's when his instincts shifted from annoyance to caution. Caleb had seen this pattern before. Not here, but in cities. where developers used informal groundwork to push into private land under the pretense of civic improvement. He had advised on cases just like it, where residents were boxed in with new rules they didn't agree to, cornered by vague language and ultimately forced into compliance through attrition, paperwork, and technicalities. Still, he didn't want to assume too much. He documented everything: photos, timestamps, exact locations. Then he called the county recorder's office to double-check the property boundaries. Nothing had changed. No public works projects were registered in his zone. No encroachment filings. No committee activity extending into his side of the line. On paper, he was clean, and yet the markers multiplied. By the end of the week, there were 6 reflective flags lining the outer edge of his drive, all placed neatly in line like some kind of prelude to forced landscaping. Caleb didn't escalate. Not yet. He drafted a letter, politely asking for identification of the individuals responsible for the signage, citing property rights and requesting the immediate removal of unapproved objects. He walked it over to the nearest committee officer's home, a woman named Karen Hobbs, who had once waved to him from her manicured garden and then never spoken another word. She answered the door with her smile already fixed, hands folded like she had been expecting company. When he handed her the letter, her expression barely shifted. "I don't handle enforcement," she said, as if that explained everything. But if concerns were raised, the committee is obligated to ensure neighborhood standards are upheld. When Caleb asked what standards, she gave him a look that hovered between sympathy and condescension. Safety, mostly. Drainage, erosion control. These are things we take seriously. Caleb didn't argue. There was no point. Instead, he left and made another call, this time to the private law office of a land use specialist he'd once worked with on a municipal runoff case. Her name was Leah Milton, and although they hadn't spoken in nearly 10 years, she remembered him. When he explained the situation, she paused for a long moment, then asked a single question. "Is your property officially annexed into the committee district?" "No," he replied. "Then you're dealing with assumption of authority," she said. "They're hoping you won't push back." That evening, Caleb stood at the edge of his property, staring down the line of flags that someone else had planted in his soil. The sky was overcast, wind moving gently through the trees, and somewhere behind him, a neighbor's porch light flickered on. He could feel the shift in atmosphere. Not just inconvenience, but a slow pressure mounting in the ground beneath his feet. These weren't signs. They were signals. Messages wrapped in plastic and silence. He didn't know what game they were playing. But he did know one thing. If they thought he would let it slide, they'd badly miscalculated. The rain started early that morning. Soft at first, like a whisper on the tin roof, and then slowly gathering force as if the sky had made up its mind about something. Caleb sat at his kitchen table watching droplets race down the window beside the sink. He had always liked rainy days. They gave the world clarity. Water didn't lie. It followed gravity, exposed the shape of things, revealed where structures were strong and where they weren't. He had built his driveway with rain in mind. The slope was shallow but deliberate, just enough to channel runoff without allowing momentum to erode the base. He had lined the edge with local stone to contain scatter. It worked, every time, which made what happened next all the more infuriating. At exactly 9:27 a.m., Caleb received an email. No subject line, no greeting, just a PDF attachment titled Community Risk Assessment Addendum A. It wasn't from a government agency or legal office. The address ended in a vague acronym he didn't recognize, but it contained phrases he knew all too well. Preliminary findings, resident safety liability, potential corrective enforcement. He opened the attachment with a growing sense of irritation. It was a 2-page mock report filled with generic language and speculative conclusions. It claimed that an unregulated ingress path posed an elevated risk to neighborhood safety due to material displacement, lack of consistent grading, and surface particulate exposure. It concluded with a note recommending temporary closure pending remediation or compliance certification. Caleb closed his laptop, stood up slowly, and walked out the front door. The rain had thinned to a drizzle, and his boots made a dull crunch on the gravel as he stepped onto the drive. Everything was where it should be. No pooling water, no erosion, no debris, just wet stone, compacted and doing its job. But as he reached the mouth of the driveway, his stomach tightened. Across the entrance, stretched between two thin steel posts, was a plastic chain barrier. Hanging from it, laminated and glistening with rain, was a sign: "Temporary closure, site under review, authorized access only." He didn't move for a full minute. The sign flapped slightly in the breeze, and the silence around him thickened with something weightier than weather. There were no vehicles parked nearby, no workers, no faces, just the quiet violence of action taken without permission. He crouched beside one of the posts. It had been driven directly into his land, maybe 10 inches off the property boundary, as if someone thought shifting a foot or two would go unnoticed. He touched the base, feeling the cold steel through wet leather. There was no city logo, no tag from Public Works, no inspection sticker. This was not state action. This was theater. Staged authority masquerading as governance. Caleb didn't remove the chain. Not yet. He went back inside, took pictures, cataloged everything, and then called the county zoning office. The clerk who answered sounded tired, distracted. When he asked about any active enforcement orders on his property, she paused, tapped on her keyboard, and said, "Nothing showing in our system, sir." No open cases, no inspections scheduled. When he asked if any permit or administrative order had been issued under a local neighborhood board, she asked for the name. Caleb told her the name of the nearby committee, and she sighed. "They're not formally recognized as a municipal authority. We don't oversee them. If there's an issue, you'll need to handle it directly." He knew that answer was coming, but hearing it aloud still felt like a door slamming in his face. What the committee lacked in legal jurisdiction, they made up for in tactics. Small, steady encroachments designed to exhaust rather than confront. They didn't send cease and desists or knock on your door with demands. They posted signs with official-looking fonts, used language vague enough to imply power but non-committal enough to avoid liability. They weren't a government, but they didn't need to be. They just needed you to believe that resisting them was more trouble than it was worth. That evening, Caleb drafted a formal notice of trespass and unauthorized alteration of private property. He referenced the local property code, attached images of the barrier, and copied both the committee chair and 2 of the county supervisors. He hand-delivered a copy to Karen Hobbs's mailbox and retained a time-stamped copy for his files. Then he removed the chain, rolled it up, and placed it in a box labeled "Evidence" in his garage. He left the steel posts for now, partly as a reminder, partly to see if someone would return to check on them. And they did. The next day, shortly after noon, he heard the faint sound of a car engine idling near the end of the driveway. He didn't go out, not right away. He watched through the blinds. A white SUV with no plates lingered for nearly 10 minutes. A man in a dark windbreaker stepped out, walked over to one of the posts, inspected the base, then turned to take photos. He didn't knock, didn't look toward the house, just got back in the SUV and drove away. That was the moment Caleb understood this wasn't about gravel or driveways or surface particulate anything. It was about control, and not just the abstract kind. Someone, or some group, had decided his independence was inconvenient. Maybe it was the visual inconsistency of his property compared to the manicured repetition of the rest of the neighborhood. Maybe it was Karen and her soft-spoken authority complex. Maybe it was something dumber, like property values. But the reason didn't matter as much as the intent. They weren't just trying to regulate him. They were trying to wear him down. He met with Leah Milton later that week, bringing with him everything he had: photos, emails, printouts, the box with the chain and laminated sign. She listened without interrupting, flipping through the materials slowly, her brow furrowed not in confusion but focus. When he finished, she looked at him and said, "They're building a case, or at least pretending to. The danger is not in what they've done, but in what they might claim you did in response." Caleb nodded. "That's why I haven't touched the posts, or contacted them directly beyond the notice." "That was smart," she said. "But here's what's coming next. They'll either escalate by alleging community disruption, noise, obstruction, non-compliance, or they'll claim your driveway creates runoff that affects adjacent properties. That gives them a wedge to file for a compliance order, which you'll win eventually, but not without cost." He looked out the office window, the glass tinted just enough to obscure the world outside. "So, what do I do now?" "Wait." "You document," Leah said. "Everything. And you prepare. If they go public, you don't follow. You go precise, legal, surgical. Let them escalate. Then you respond with facts, not noise." That night, Caleb sat on his porch with a mug of coffee, watching as dusk settled over the trees. He wasn't angry, not yet. But the seed had been planted, not just by the sign or the posts or the SUV with no plates, but by the quiet certainty that this wasn't a mistake. This was a strategy. He could feel it in the way no one returned his letters, in the way the committee deflected responsibility, in the way silence had become their primary weapon. He set his coffee down, stood, and walked the length of his driveway again, this time with a measuring wheel. Every slope, every inch, every contour, recorded. Not because he needed to prove anything, but because when they came again, and he knew they would, he wanted to be ready. 3 days later, Caleb woke up to the sound of wheels grinding against gravel. Not the usual subtle crunch of delivery vans or his own truck, but something heavier and slower, deliberate in movement and clearly unauthorized. He slipped on his boots without lacing them, threw on his jacket, and stepped outside into the gray morning. A municipal utility truck, city-branded but unfamiliar, stood just beyond the tree line, idling with hazard lights blinking. The truck wasn't parked on the road, though. It was angled inward with one of its wheels partially over the edge of Caleb's drive. 2 men in orange vests stood beside it, talking in low tones while pointing down at the gravel. One of them had a clipboard. Neither of them noticed Caleb approaching until he was almost 10 feet away. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He simply asked, "Can I help you?" with the kind of voice that's too calm to ignore. The man with the clipboard looked up, feigned a polite nod, and said, "Morning, sir. We're just conducting an inspection. Routine grading review." Caleb didn't respond immediately. He looked at the truck again, then back at the 2 men. "Grading review? On private property?" The man shifted slightly. "We received a complaint about runoff issues affecting community drainage infrastructure. We're not taking any enforcement actions, just gathering visual documentation." Caleb glanced down at the man's badge. It wasn't county. It wasn't even city. It was subcontracted. A third-party environmental services firm sometimes used by municipalities to pad inspection numbers. He knew them. He had rejected their bids during his time in the department because they submitted templates instead of actual reports. Now they were standing on his land, pointing at things they didn't understand, hoping he'd assume they were legitimate. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the property," Caleb said, still measured but with steel beneath. "This is not a public road. You're not authorized to be here." The second man, younger and trying to stay neutral, looked down and muttered something about getting back to the office. The man with the clipboard hesitated, then nodded. All right, no problem. Just doing our job. Have a good day, sir. They climbed into the truck and rolled backward with deliberate slowness, but Caleb noticed the subtle twist of the clipboard as the older man held it, angling it toward the trees, clicking a photo with the phone clipped to its back, not of the driveway, of Caleb. He didn't react. He just waited until they were out of sight, then walked the full length of the drive, inspecting the surface. Nothing had changed. The slope was clean. The drainage ditches were dry. The shoulder rocks held firm, but at the bottom corner, near the storm grate that fed into the shared runoff culvert outside his boundary, someone had planted a PVC stake. Fresh, white, and unmarked. Caleb took it, snapped it clean in half, and brought it inside. By that evening, the story had begun spreading. Not online. Caleb didn't use the neighborhood forums, but in tone, in looks, in the almost imperceptible shift of atmosphere. He went to pick up a package at the courier drop point near the community market, and the clerk, who usually said nothing beyond "sign here," added a casual, "Hope you're getting that driveway looked at, neighbor." It wasn't a threat. It was worse. It was familiarity, the false comfort of inclusion being offered in the form of compliance. 2 days later, Caleb received a certified letter. Not from the county, not from a court, from the so-called committee. The letterhead was fake official, bold serif font, clip art watermark of a tree. The letter began with, "We, the undersigned members of the Community Stewardship Board," and then launched into a 2-page explanation of how Caleb's property had become a source of concern, citing community unity, aesthetic alignment, and, bizarrely, vehicular safety standards. The core demand was buried in the middle. Effective immediately, please cease use of the current ingress path until such time as a board-approved remediation plan can be reviewed and adopted. The arrogance of the language was almost impressive. Caleb read it twice, then filed it under frivolous communications. But he didn't ignore it. He responded with a notarized reply, citing the legal boundaries of his property, the lack of any annexation agreement, and a reminder that non-governmental boards have no jurisdiction over unincorporated parcels. He copied the response to Leah Milton, who replied the next morning with 3 words. They're testing thresholds. Then the vandalism began. Subtle at first. His mailbox post, which had stood unbothered for 18 months, was found tilted at a 30-degree angle one morning, as if someone had leaned on it with slow, sustained pressure. He found tire tracks on the outer edge of his drainage trench, too wide for a car, more like an ATV. Packages began arriving with damaged labels. Nothing criminal, nothing provable. Just enough to signal presence. And then there was the noise. Low-frequency hums at night, coming from the edge of his property, too rhythmic to be accidental, likely a generator or a sonic pest deterrent repurposed as a harassment tool. Caleb walked the perimeter multiple nights in a row with a sound meter. Every time he approached the tree line, the hum would stop. Every time he retreated, it would start again. He recorded everything. Cataloged time, date, weather, decibel range. He filed a nuisance report with the county. But without a clear source or violator, enforcement was unlikely. That was the point. Whoever was orchestrating this understood the power of deniable disruption. The goal wasn't to damage him. It was to fatigue him. Then came the moment that shifted everything. One morning, Caleb received a visit from the postal carrier. A substitute he hadn't seen before, young and over-caffeinated. The man handed him a parcel and, almost casually, said, "Heads up, I saw the neighborhood lady taking pictures of your front lot from the cul-de-sac. Had a clipboard and everything. Said she was checking for runoff violations." That even a thing? Caleb didn't answer. He thanked the man and walked straight to his workroom. He opened his laptop, pulled up the documentation Leah had prepared months ago, and cross-referenced his easement agreements with regional floodplain maps. Nothing had changed. His property was still self-contained. There were no violations. But now he knew they were preparing to allege one. He upgraded the perimeter cameras. Not because he feared confrontation, but because he needed proof. Real proof. Not paranoia, not shadows. Footage. That night, someone walked the edge of his eastern property line. A woman in a windbreaker. Blonde, phone in hand, pausing to take pictures. Not stepping onto his land, but close enough to graze it with her presence. When the motion alert pinged his phone, Caleb didn't go out. He watched the video feed. Zoomed, paused, studied the face. It was Karen. She wasn't smiling. The next morning, a folded notice was tucked under his windshield wiper. No envelope. Just a single page, typed. Further non-compliance will result in coordinated community action. We urge you to seek resolution voluntarily. He read it 3 times before tossing it onto the passenger seat. Then he drove, not to the store, not to a lawyer, but to the industrial supply warehouse 2 towns over, where he placed a specific order for something he had once used in municipal desing projects. High-concentration calcium chloride rock salt. 80 pounds of it. He paid in cash. He said nothing to anyone. He waited. The salt arrived in plain, unmarked bags, heavy enough that Caleb had to cart them from the back of his truck in 2 rounds. The weight wasn't the problem. It was the significance. He didn't treat the material as a weapon, not in the traditional sense. He treated it as a statement. It wasn't about revenge or proving a point through destruction. It was about balance, returning the intrusion in kind, scaled precisely and cleanly. Karen and her committee had encroached onto his land with unofficial signage, intimidation tactics, and bureaucratic mimicry. He wouldn't respond with threats or lawsuits. Not yet. He would respond the way any system responds to stress, by realigning pressure points. At dusk, he loaded a hand spreader with the rock salt and set out on foot, working his way along the shared pedestrian paths that framed the interior of the neighborhood. Not technically his responsibility, but not technically restricted either. He chose the outer sidewalk that bordered the common garden the committee used to showcase their seasonal aesthetics. Low pines, decorative mulch, fragile ornamentals chosen more for appearance than survival. He walked evenly, not rushed, distributing salt in an elegant, deliberate arc just beyond the curb line. He didn't overdo it. He didn't scatter across lawns or make a mess of driveways. He stuck to walkways and drainage trenches, the very same areas they had cited as vulnerable. By the time he finished, the sky had darkened and the temperature had dropped enough that dew began forming across exposed surfaces. He returned home, stored the spreader, and poured himself a glass of water. He didn't watch the cameras that night. He didn't hover near the window. He let the system work. By morning, the results were subtle but unmistakable. Pale mineral streaks ran along the edges of the stone pavers. 2 sections of low shrubbery near the central bench had already begun to wilt, curling at the tips where the salted runoff had soaked the roots. The trash receptacles, usually pristine and ornamental, now showed the early signs of corrosion. Small, uneven blisters at the base where metal met concrete. It wasn't sabotage, it was science. Everything he had touched was technically unharmed, but visibly altered. The pristine veneer the committee had so carefully curated now bore fractures, not deep enough to trigger immediate alarm, but enough to unsettle. Enough to say, "I see you, I understand your method, and I can speak it fluently." The response didn't take long. By midday, a post appeared on the community bulletin board, not addressed to him directly, but clearly designed as a warning. It mentioned a concerning pattern of nighttime activity, unauthorized applications of chemical substances, and potential threats to shared property aesthetics and soil health. It urged residents to report suspicious nocturnal landscaping behavior and to review their home security footage for unfamiliar movements. Caleb read it with calm interest. There was no mention of salt, no evidence, just fear. But it wasn't the post that confirmed the message had landed. It was the silence. For the next 2 days, no one walked the eastern paths. No one lingered at the committee benches. Even Karen's ritual morning strolls ceased. The neighborhood, once so proud of its false civility, had turned inward, like a turtle drawing into its shell at the first brush of wind. Caleb could feel the shift not just in posture, but in energy. There were no knocks at his door, no new signage, no follow-up letters, just an eerie stillness that suggested regrouping. He spent that lull wisely. He met again with Leah, presented updated documentation, and listened as she described the likely trajectory of escalation. "They'll try a procedural route next," she said. "Not legal, procedural, something soft. A grievance filed with a regulatory body you didn't know you were subject to. They'll claim community consultation, even if it never happened. Their goal is to box you into a defense." Caleb nodded. "And what's our move?" "Quiet," she replied. "Let them file. Let them overreach. Then we introduce the documents showing their lack of jurisdiction. You want them to feel like they're winning right up until they realize they've stepped outside the rule book they built." That night, Caleb received an anonymous note. Not typed, but handwritten in blue ink, neat block lettering, folded cleanly and slid under his front door. It said only one sentence: "This won't end with landscaping." No signature, no threat of violence, just the promise of scope expansion. Caleb read it once, twice, and then filed it beside the chain and the committee letters. He didn't react. He understood what it was. Not a warning, but a test. Whoever had written it wanted to know if he would flinch. He didn't. Instead, he doubled down, not on retaliation, but on documentation. He installed a second layer of passive infrared sensors near the perimeter trees, calibrated to track body heat through foliage. He invested in a wildlife camera for the back end of his lot, the one place not yet reached by the committee's slow encroachment. And he filed a request under the state's Sunshine Law for any records or filings submitted by the community board concerning his address. It would take time, but when the committee acted, and they would, he wanted a paper trail already forming in parallel. Then, as predicted, came the Environmental Quality Notice, delivered via a courier service pretending to be official. It wasn't from the city. It wasn't from the state. It was from a fabricated oversight group, a subcommittee created by the board to monitor green space impact. The notice cited potential soil acidification stemming from non-natural compound application, and offered an opportunity for voluntary compliance before escalation. It was absurd in its structure, a Frankenstein of technical terms with no basis in law. But it was real in one way. It had been printed, delivered, and filed. Caleb scanned it, logged it, and sent it to Leah, who replied a few hours later with a single sentence: "Perfect. Let them speak louder." The midpoint had arrived not with confrontation, but with exposure. They had moved first. He had responded in kind, and now, with both sides marked and documented, the game would change. It would move from silence to noise, from whispers to procedures, from influence to defense. Caleb wasn't angry. He wasn't anxious. He was aligned, not with vengeance, but with clarity. They had shown him what they were willing to do to maintain power. Now it was his turn to show them what happened when power met principle, and the principle came prepared. It started with the lawn. Not Caleb's. He didn't have one. His front perimeter was a blend of natural gravel, native grasses, and drought-resistant shrubs he had selected not for show, but for sustainability. The committee hated it, though they never said so outright. They preferred the chemically green monotony of treated sod, edged weekly and watered daily. So when, one Monday morning, The irrigation line that fed the central garden 3 parcels down ruptured and overflowed into the shared trench near Caleb's boundary. It didn't take long for someone to imply blame. The water had carved a small gully along the edge of the committee's path and pooled near the lowest curb, staining the sidewalk with pale brown sediment. It wasn't dramatic, and any second-year landscaping student could have diagnosed the issue as internal pipe fatigue or poor slope design, but that wasn't the story they wanted. Instead, a public notice appeared, this time stapled to the corkboard near the community kiosk. Due to recent erosion events caused by non-compliant runoff surfaces, a formal site review will be initiated for properties on the eastern boundary. It didn't mention Caleb by name, but everyone knew who they meant. The timing was no coincidence. Caleb had spent the last 2 weeks tightening every inch of his documentation, coordinating with Leah, and preparing a quiet set of administrative complaints against the committee's unlicensed activity. He hadn't gone public. He hadn't retaliated. But they had seen the signs. The cameras, the new sensors, the way he moved more deliberately through his lot like a man building a case. That same afternoon, Karen Hobbs made her return, walking at the pace of someone performing civility. She stopped at the edge of Caleb's drive, glanced down at the gravel as if trying to spot crime in geometry, then looked up at the window where she knew the cameras were. She smiled, not warmly, not even politely, just enough to show she understood the rules of the current game. Then she turned, walked away, and within the hour, Caleb received a notification from the county permitting board. A request had been filed to conduct a formal topographical reassessment of his property's impact on adjacent plots. The request came not from the city, not from a utility, but from a concerned neighborhood oversight panel, listed as a nonprofit with no legal standing and no charter. Still, the county couldn't ignore a formal request, and so a junior assessor, fresh from certification, barely 30, showed up at Caleb's lot 2 days later. She was polite, almost apologetic, and tried to make small talk as she worked her way around the slope. Caleb didn't interfere. He showed her the drainage maps, the elevation drawings, the soil composition report he'd commissioned 3 months prior. She nodded a lot, took photos, and eventually muttered, "Honestly, this place is better managed than most of the official sites I've been on." But that wasn't the end. The committee wasn't looking for facts. They were looking for footage, for headlines, for a perception that something needed fixing. So when Caleb's neighbor, an older woman named Edna, who rarely left her porch, claimed she had seen excess runoff washing into her petunias, the narrative shifted again. Another notice appeared, this time more aggressive in tone. The board has received multiple accounts of property damage stemming from unregulated stormwater discharge. A resolution vote will be held to determine mandatory compliance procedures. Leah was already ahead of them. She'd filed a cease and desist order against the use of Caleb's name or property in unofficial community memos. It didn't stop them from circulating the notice. They just redacted the address and added a blurry photo of what might have been a gravel path but could just as easily have been any sidewalk under repair. The absurdity of it all wasn't even the point anymore. It wasn't about gravel or water or even law. It was about leverage, the slow, persistent layering of pressure until resistance felt exhausting. Then came the turning point. One night, Caleb returned from a supply run to find his southern boundary markers uprooted. Not removed, not stolen, just lifted and left lying at awkward angles, as if someone wanted to imply that the land itself was up for debate. That same night, one of his cameras captured movement, a pair of shadows crossing through the tree line, pausing near his tool shed, then disappearing before the motion light could catch them. He sent the footage to Leah. She flagged it for record but cautioned, "Still not enough for criminal charges. We need intent and repeat patterns." 2 days later, the committee delivered that gift themselves. At 3:46 p.m., a city inspector knocked on Caleb's door. Not a subcontractor, not a surveyor, A real, credentialed municipal officer with a clipboard, badge, and an expression that said he hated being involved in this kind of thing. He explained awkwardly that a formal complaint had been filed alleging unpermitted structural modifications affecting shared water infrastructure. Caleb didn't react. He invited the man in, walked him through every piece of documentation, and then pointed out the key fact. There was no shared infrastructure. His runoff drained into a retention zone wholly within his boundaries. The inspector didn't argue. He just nodded slowly and said, "I'm going to go ahead and write that no violations were observed today, but you're going to want to stay ahead of this. Whoever's behind it knows how to play the long game." That night, Caleb didn't sleep much. He wasn't scared. He wasn't even angry in the conventional sense. He was calculating, mentally assembling the timeline, the escalation, the pattern. The committee wasn't operating independently anymore. They'd recruited the machinery of slow governance, not overtly, not officially, but through the exploitation of public processes. He wasn't facing a neighbor dispute. He was facing institutionalized harassment under the guise of civic responsibility. The next day, Leah called with a plan. "It's time we invert their strategy," she said. "No more waiting. We file a structural harassment claim. Not against individuals, against the board as an entity. We request an injunction against any further contact, filing, or proxy activity related to your property. But we don't file it locally. We go 2 levels up, regional circuit. That way, even if the local court delays, they're forced to respond." Caleb agreed. He transferred the latest footage, the inspector's report, the boundary photos, and every memo with a timestamp. Leah compiled them into a package and submitted the injunction the following morning. Within 48 hours, the board received notice of action. Caleb expected a backlash. What he got was something stranger: withdrawal. The committee went silent. No new posts, no visits. The paths were swept, the signs removed. Even Karen disappeared, her porch chair vacant for the first time in months. It felt too clean, too sudden, like someone had warned them that the game had changed and the consequences were no longer symbolic. But Caleb wasn't fooled. He kept his cameras running. He updated his logs, and 3 days later, the final piece clicked into place. An email arrived from a third-party maintenance vendor claiming to represent a neighborhood redevelopment coalition. The message requested access to Caleb's property for an aesthetic realignment consultation. It read like it had been written by someone trying to sound neutral while offering a bribe. Caleb forwarded it to Leah, who confirmed the company was linked to a local land acquisition firm that specialized in hostile redevelopment. Their strategy was simple: drive the target into legal fatigue, then offer a buyout as an exit path. Caleb didn't reply. He didn't need to. They had tipped their hand. The harassment hadn't been about power or safety or unity. It had been about real estate, about control of the land, the layout, and eventually the market. His gravel road wasn't the problem. It was the excuse. His independence was the real threat. And now that their campaign had failed to intimidate or discredit him, they were pivoting to temptation. It was almost laughable. But Caleb wasn't laughing. He opened the salt storage cabinet, checked his reserves, and waited. He knew the silence wouldn't last. And this time, when they made their move, he would be ready with more than footage. He'd have the law, the record, and the one thing they never expected: someone who had already been through this once and learned how to win without raising his voice. The silence didn't break all at once. It eroded slowly, like everything else in that place, wearing away at the edge of normal until it became just a little too quiet, a little too clean. The cameras kept catching movement at odd hours. Not bodies this time, but objects. A trash bin repositioned 10 feet left, one of the reflective markers from months ago suddenly reappearing, jammed into the dry soil near the utility box like a relic, from a war they hadn't quite finished. Caleb watched without reacting. He'd learned the tempo of their actions now. Feint, pull back, distract, reframe. But what they didn't seem to realize was that all their movements, once so subtly coordinated, had begun to fray under the pressure of attention. The salt had done its job better than expected, not in what it destroyed, but in what it revealed. The committee had cracked, and then, on a Thursday morning that started like any other, coffee, perimeter check, inbox scan, Caleb received the trigger they must have spent weeks drafting, a formal notice, mailed directly from the office of the County Property Adjustment Board, not the committee, but clearly at their urging. It stated that a temporary stay had been placed on any modifications to Zone 14B, which included Caleb's parcel, pending a review of infrastructure compliance and community aesthetic integration. The language was vague, yet insidious. Integration. Not regulation. Not compliance. It was a word chosen for its ambiguity, a net cast wide enough to trap anyone who didn't look exactly like their neighbors. Caleb called Leah immediately. She was already reading the same document. She had been carbon copied through the circuit court's preliminary challenge system and knew exactly what it meant. "They've gone regional," she said flatly. "They're trying to push your case up into shared zoning logic so they can bury your parcel in paperwork while the redevelopment coalition lobbies to redefine your property line as a civic corridor." "They can't do that," Caleb replied, but the edge in his voice wasn't doubt. It was fury struggling to stay polite. "They can't succeed," Leah corrected, "but they can try. And while they try, your land becomes unsteady. Lenders won't touch it. Appraisers will devalue it. That's the play. They're not trying to win in court. They're trying to exhaust the timeline." Caleb said nothing for a while. He just stared at the window, the gravel road stretching away under the high morning sun, every inch of it placed by his own hand, every slope calculated not for appearance but for integrity. They wanted to erase that, not just the surface, the concept of it, the message that you could exist here without being absorbed. "No more silence," he said finally. That evening, Caleb drafted a public report, not a rant, not a manifesto, but a clean, factual document titled A Record of Harassment, Encroachment, and Jurisdictional Abuse Within Zone 14B. He published it through a neutral public archive service, the kind used by engineers and auditors, and he sent copies directly to county supervisors, regional press contacts, and 2 environmental attorneys known for pro bono work in property abuse cases. He didn't make accusations. He listed events, dates, images. He included the fabricated notices, the invasive photographs, the fake board signatures, the salt response and its after effects, all of it layered not as drama, but as evidence. When he hit send, he didn't feel triumphant. He felt surgical. The response came quickly. By the next week, 2 things happened simultaneously. The Property Adjustment Board received a cease process request from a newly appointed legal intermediary representing the community board, an apparent attempt to pause the storm they'd started, and an anonymous whistleblower forwarded Caleb an internal memo. It detailed a plan drafted by the redevelopment group, outlining a proposed expansion of the HOA's technical boundary to include all non-member parcels for collective governance stabilization. Caleb was listed by name under primary friction zones. He sent the memo to Leah. She didn't respond for an hour. Then just 4 words. "This goes federal now." Within days, Caleb's report was cited in a regional zoning commission review hearing. 2 of the coalition's board members were called in for a preliminary ethics interview after a misused funding disclosure surfaced, likely triggered by one of the attorneys who had picked up Caleb's file. Karen's name appeared in the commission log not as a complainant, but as a listed source for unlicensed municipal liaisons. For someone who had spent the last year orchestrating control from behind laminated signs and anonymous memos, that must have been her breaking point. She showed up unannounced. It was just past 6:30 p.m., light still holding in the treetops, when Caleb heard the crunch of tires and stepped onto his porch. Karen stood at the end of the driveway, not crossing the boundary, not even pretending to smile this time. Her mouth was tight, her shoulders square, a woman not pleading but boiling, all diplomacy burned out. She didn't shout, she didn't threaten. She just said, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Caleb looked at her, not with hatred, not even disdain, but with the cold clarity of someone who had seen every brick in the wall and knew which ones had been faked. "You should leave before the cameras get the wrong angle," he said. She didn't move. Then slowly she turned, walked back to her car, and drove off. She never came back. That night, Caleb got word from Leah. The injunction was upheld. The board could not act in any official or semi-official capacity regarding his property for no less than 18 months, pending review of their operational legitimacy. The expansion initiative was dissolved under regional zoning code violations. The fabricated environmental notices were nullified. Caleb's land was declared fully independent and protected under landowner exclusion protocols for abuse zones. But more than that, a second order followed. The board's records were subpoenaed. Not just for Caleb's case, but to determine if similar tactics had been used elsewhere. Their silence had not protected them. It had implicated them. And so the structure broke, not with an explosion, but with 100 quiet disintegrations. The committee fractured. Karen resigned. The redevelopment group pulled out of the area. A month later, Caleb stood at the edge of his drive, wind moving gently over the gravel, and saw a small, handwritten sign posted on one of the old community boards. Seeking volunteers for a new civic garden project. No affiliations required. He didn't join. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. His gravel road remained, untouched, intact, and the salt, long since washed away, had done what it needed to do. Summer settled over the neighborhood in slow, dense layers, heat clinging to surfaces, insects humming low in the dry spaces between buildings, and the trees casting long, flickering shadows across the now quiet streets. The silence that once carried menace had shifted. It no longer watched. It listened. The war, if that's what it could be called, was over. Not with flags or announcements or a community vote, but with the gradual retraction of a force that had overstepped one line too many and underestimated just how much resistance a quiet man could hold when cornered. Caleb never saw an apology. That wasn't how people like Karen operated. There were no acknowledgments of wrongdoing, no hand-delivered notes, no sudden admissions. Only absence. Her porch stayed empty. Her car disappeared from its usual slot by the hedges. Eventually, a real estate sign appeared at the far end of her lot, and no one in the neighborhood seemed surprised when the listing vanished less than a week later, marked as sold to an out-of-town buyer. She was gone, and in the way of small, tight-knit neighborhoods too proud to admit fault, her name faded fast, first in conversation, then in memory. Caleb didn't celebrate. He didn't drink, or post online, or call anyone to gloat. He simply returned to what he'd always done. Wake early, walk the perimeter, adjust the layout of the gravel where needed, and watch the water move after every rain. There was satisfaction, of course, but not the kind that comes from winning. It was deeper than that. Quieter. It was the feeling of having endured, not through force or spectacle, but through patience, preparation, and refusal to be shaped by someone else's vision of order. His land remained as it had always been. Not perfect, not ornamental, but correct. Purposeful. His. The damage they'd tried to do hadn't touched the ground. It had only touched time. And time, as it turned out, was something Caleb had learned to use wisely. Word of the board's collapse filtered out in fragments. A few neighbors, ones who had never spoken much before, started waving from a distance, a gesture that seemed less about friendliness and more about acknowledgement. Two of them even asked politely about the gravel. One man, younger, with a new mortgage and a wary expression, asked if Caleb would mind sharing the supplier's contact. Caleb gave it to him without commentary. He didn't need to preach. His driveway had already made the argument. Later that month, the sound of a compacting roller could be heard on the other end of the street. Another resident laying stone, another quiet nod. The final letter arrived not from the committee, it no longer existed, but from the Regional Zoning Board. A printed notice, crisp and formal, confirming the permanent declassification of his parcel from any civic oversight body formed without state-recognized jurisdiction. It was worded in dry legal terms, but the meaning was clear. No one would ever try to regulate his gravel again. That evening, Caleb sat in his garage, the windows open to let the warm air drift through, the smell of dust and pine mixing with the faint metallic scent of old tools and fresh mineral from the driveway. He took out the box where he had stored everything: the chain, the first laminated sign, the fake notices, the anonymous threats. He flipped through them slowly, not out of nostalgia, but out of completeness. Each item was a record, a note in a long, bitter symphony that had played out across his land and ended in a single, undeniable chord: presence. He'd stayed. They hadn't. He burned the papers in the steel drum behind the shed, not in anger and not to erase the past, but to clear space. Not everything needed to be archived. Some battles once won didn't need retelling, only remembering. A week later, a new neighbor moved in across the way. A woman in her 40s, practical and polite, with 2 kids and no evident interest in neighborhood drama. She introduced herself one morning with a wave and a box of nails, asking if he had a spare hammer she could borrow. Caleb handed her one, nodded once, and returned to his